All right, folks, we're at 7:05. I want to be respectful of everyone's time and thank you for being here. My name is Danielle Faguira. I'm the Director of Alumni and Parent Engagement here at Landmark. This is my fourth school year. I'm thrilled to have you here tonight, part of our Landmark Learn series, bringing resources to parents on timely topics that are important to them. So I'll be managing tonight's session. I'm excited to tell you share who our speakers are and dive into the content a bit. I know it's something that is on everyone's mind, and this was one of the topics that folks signed up for very quickly and more than once. So we know it is top of mind. Tonight, we will be recording the session. So please remember that this is being recorded and will be shared via the weekly newsletter, and the resources will be available on the school website afterwards. So if you want to go back and watch it again or share it with someone else, you're more than welcome to do that. And both of the slide decks that will be shared tonight will be available as well. So if it just suits you to sit back, relax, and enjoy, you're welcome to do that, and you can review the materials later. And we'll hold all questions until the end of the presentation. What I'll do is if you have pressing questions throughout, you're more than welcome to put them in the chat. I'm going to hold on to all of those and combine similar questions and field them to our presenters at the end. So that is sort of the best way we can manage the questions. But if you have something more personal in nature, please feel free to reach out to either of the speakers or myself separately. I know they'd be happy to connect with you. So tonight we have, very happy to have two presenters from the high school campus to talk about anxiety in both a contextual and clinical setting. So we have Rob Genitelli, who is our Dean of Students for 25 years at Landmark School. He's going to focus on the contextual piece, what he's seen in his experience, what that looks like at Landmark School, how it presents in different ways, and things you may be seeing at home. And then Dan Larson, our high school counseling department head, who has 3 years of experience at Landmark and 10 years experience at a treatment facility for anxiety disorders. We'll focus more on the clinical side tonight and talk about the things that sort of lead up to anxiety, what's happening in your student's brain, and again, sort of how that's presenting at home and different tools and resources that are available to you. I am by no means an expert, just here to deliver the fun and hopefully be of help to all of you. So if you have any questions, you're welcome to message me in the chat privately as well. So what we will do is begin with Rob. Rob has a slide deck that he is going to go through. Dan may comment and add feedback throughout the presentation. And then Dan will show a deck of his own as well. And then at the end, we will answer questions. We expect the presentation to last about 50 minutes, give or take, and we'll have time for questions at the end. So I hope that is helpful to folks. And if you need anything, again, just put a note in the chat and I will respond to you. So thank you. And Rob, we'll start with you.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. I feel really lucky to go first. I feel like I'm like the kind of the not so great warm up for the great band that's coming later. So I appreciate you indulging me a bit, waiting to get to Dan, who's got the substance of what we're going to do. So I'm going to play in the world of technology, which is not my strong suit, and hope that it all populates up. And there we go. So for me, I want to start by just saying that the concept of anxiety, both from a professional standpoint, is what I see during the day, and from a personal standpoint, what I live with our youngest. We have two children, a 28-year-old and a 22-year-old. And our 22-year-old, our daughter, has been a person who hasn't been diagnosed with anxiety, but she is an anxiety-based child. And so for me, there's this nuance between what I do professionally and what I do personally. And the piece I want to offer is that I'm so good at it professionally and I'm so bad at it personally. So I certainly understand how it is to work with and be involved with someone, a young person, someone that you love that at times has anxiety or anxiety-based responses. So for me, the concept of anxiety, I kind of ask myself, and again, what Danielle says more contextually, like, is this our new normal? Is anxiety and anxiety disorders and anxiety-based responses our new normal going forward? In my 25 years at Landmark, I would tell you, Landmark has always worked with kids that were anxious, but it was generally speaking anxious about their school-based experience. And when they arrived to Landmark School and they were in the environment of Landmark School, we saw that school-based anxiety begin to dissipate because they're in an environment, obviously, that addressed and met their needs. Probably within the last, I would say, 10 years or so, there was a shift in the adolescent world and a shift, I think, in our society in general. And that's kind of what I want to spend a little bit of time kind of sharing my thoughts on it with you. So, all right, there we go. First glitch. Come on, advance. There we go. So my premise is that in the past 5 years, there's been an explosion based on the student records and profiles that I read in terms of anxiety and anxiety-related disorders. And I ask myself, like, why is that happening? Or rather, what in our world is happening that would create such a profound shift in adolescent development? Because that's where I spend most of my time, like assessing and looking at students and who they are and what they do to kind of figure out what makes them tick and what's cooking with them. So this is what I want to talk about. And this is what I've spent a lot of time thinking about. So we're all kind of comfortable and on the same page. So anxiety is just, for me, is a general feeling of worry or nervousness, unease, typically about an imminent event or something of an uncertain outcome. And I think the piece, for me, that uncertain piece, I underlined intentionally, because when you're uncertain about something, that changes the dynamic on how you approach it. And then in general, what we've seen, so if this is what was going on in the world, this is what we've got going on in the world now. So take everything we knew about anxiety and anxiety-based responses or concerns, layer over COVID and the entire shift and change of the world, and everything we knew and believed now gets ramped up and or exacerbated significantly by the state of the world and the state of how COVID-19 has shifted and changed the world. And more importantly, how it's shifted and changed it from the vantage point of viewpoint of younger people. You know, I will tell you, as an adult, I am sick of it. I'm sick of living inside of it. I'm sick of masks and social distancing. I'm sick of hand sanitizer and disinfectant. I'm sick of, at Landmark, sitting in a cubicle to eat my lunch instead of sitting with people that I want to have meaningful conversation with. And that's me as an adult being able to use a larger lifetime of strategies to lean into and manage it for our population, and certainly the LBLD population, where we know that their profiles at times are more complicated. The additional layer of COVID brings an additional layer of concern and worry. So everything we knew and believed about anxiety, that it's just a general feeling of worry and nervousness, unease, typically about an imminent event or something of an uncertain outcome. And that's kind of the way life operates. Inside of COVID, it shifts and changes all of those dynamics, and it makes it much more challenging to figure out how to respond and work with them. So here are the common things. These are the things that we see at Landmark School, common types of anxiety disorders. At times panic disorders, social anxiety disorder. We have the OCDs, obsessive compulsive disorders, the PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and then the GAD, the general anxiety disorder. And I would tell you, for me, I spend a lot of time thinking about post-traumatic stress in terms of looking at the students that we work with, because when you study trauma and you look at trauma as a larger entity, and it isn't just about that one isolated event that created a pattern of trauma in your life. When I look for a lot of our students, the social experience they had or the educational experience they had in the wrong setting educationally at a critical time in their development, when you look at the manifestation of that as they are as a freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior, you can see patterns of post-traumatic stress components in their profile. And so we spend some time working on the concept of a trauma-based response in terms of how we go about programming for them. And that's the stuff that Dan will jump into. These are the things that we're seeing, and this is the stuff that is populating. These are things that tick through my brain when I walk around the campus. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about just two key factors. And one is fear, emotion in response to imminent threat, real or imagined. I mean, that is a reasonable need in life to go through life. You have to have some element of an awareness of fear, because you need to know how to react and respond in situations that are real or the threat. And so fear is a really healthy emotion, but it gets lumped into the sense when you move into the state of anxiety, because anxiety is more a state, an emotional state, not a response, but a state in anticipation of potential future threat, real or imagined. So for me, it runs a bit like this. So I'll use a school analogy. If I, on a Monday morning, didn't study for my test, and I know I'm going to fail it, and I have a fear of what's going to happen when I get home, that's a reasonable response to the fact that my parents are going to be mad at me that I didn't study for the test and I flunked it. If a week ahead of the exam, I am in a state of fear and worry and nerves about how I'm going to do on the exam, and that predominates my thought over that week, that's an anxiety-based response to having an exam. So one would be a realistic or reasonable response to a situation, and the other isn't. It is based more in anxiety, which at times isn't always, rational, or you're able to walk through it. So remember those two key factors. And again, Dan is going to spend a little bit of time inside of all that. But when I'm working with students, and I would tell you, when I'm working with my daughter, I have to constantly remind myself of these pieces. Which piece am I working with? Is it fear or is it anxiety that shapes how I'm going to respond and how I'm going to help support her? So it kind of looks like this. When you talk to kids, this is kind of how they feel in that moment when anxiety is kind of interrupting their routines or their daily life, where I think we can all remember back to that, whatever situation occurred for you and whatever age you were, whether you were 50, 70, 12, that moment of time where you felt the entire world was looking at you in a place of judgment, and you had that visceral response and reaction to it. Or does your brain do this, where you have all these things populating inside of your head, all pushing, and it manifests itself in some semblance of a pattern of anxiety? When I look at these two things, no one likes this, and certainly everyone can relate to this. And when you're a young person and you're trying to sort all that out, and then in the midst of all that, navigate the complexity of the social world, in addition to parental expectations and school expectations and academic expectations, I look at the seniors this year and looked at the seniors last year and looked at them trying to navigate through how to figure out what college to go to, which is an anxiety-producing experience under traditional circumstances. And I look at the seniors this year trying to sort and figure out where they're going to go next year with the limitations of what the world has to offer in terms of taking college visits, hopping on a plane, going, seeing it. We can see an uptick in their angst and anxiety and their nervousness about what their future is going to hold. I ran into this. I like this, the Pew Research Center. There's a lot of great data in there. The reason I put this up, because I think this is pretty significant. When they looked at the percentage of teens, they asked some questions about what would be a major problem or a minor problem or not a problem. And I really think that it was significant that 96% of teens in the year, I think study was done over several years, 2016 through 2018, that 96% of teens saw that depression and anxiety were a major or a minor problem. That is a significant number of young people in a significant level of distress, in a significant pattern of time in their life, that these are not things that just come and go for them. This is a state of being for them. And think about how exhausted they must be when these are the pieces that they carry. And I think about that sometimes when I'm on a student's case, when they're in residence, about, look, hey, your room is a disaster. It needs to be cleaned. You need to get in there. And they look at me like, you've got to be kidding, with everything else that I'm struggling with. You need me to make my damn bed? And I'm like, I understand. I want to break it down. Let's work together. But I worry sometimes that as we as adults lump stuff onto their plates, when I think of 96% of them are already struggling with the concepts or feelings of anxiety or depression, that plate's pretty full to begin with. And here we are asking them to do the simple tasks like make your bed, clean your room, do your homework, sometimes get to class on time. And I wonder and worry about the skill levels they have to kind of navigate some of that when all these other things are predominating their thoughts. And so for me, I just lean into that and ask them those questions like, yes, I want you to make your bed. How can I help you do that? What do we need to create together to allow that to have this opportunity for us to do this together? And oftentimes kids be like, seriously, you're gonna come in and help me clean and make my bed? I'm like, yeah, I will do that. Let's just get it done. So then it's done. And it strikes me sometimes very clearly about the fact that they present needs that we always don't pay attention to. And that for me is where I spend the majority of my time. In my household, and I share this story, I can't speak for the rest of you, but my daughter, I don't know what it is, and she wasn't tested for this, and I'd love to know the test for this, but she can't open and close a drawer. Drives me insane. She can open a drawer, take what she wants, and then somehow between getting what she wants and closing the drawer, something happens and she moves away. And when I approach her to remind her, trying not to be frustrated or agitated or irritated, because I know when I'm frustrated, agitated, or irritated with her, or I come in kind of hot, it triggers an anxiety-based response for her, and then we get nowhere. She gets upset, she withdraws, she doesn't like volume of voice, and so you have to be very careful how to address it. But it drives me insane that she can't close a drawer, to the point where when we recently renovated our kitchen, we spent an extra $1,500 on automatic drawer closers. So now she opens a drawer, takes what she wants, and the drawers just close automatically. And it is just delicious that the drawers close automatically. And if I could figure out how to create that in her bedroom, I would try to do that, but her dressers in her bedroom just don't. So I just mindfully try to redirect her, or honestly sometimes, and I know we all do this, I call it like the LD dance. I just go in and shut the drawers or close the room to her, the door to her room, and move past it. But I know that that's something that as I approach her on it, I have to approach her in a certain way, because I know the response I'm going to get. That dance is kind of difficult. And when anxiety threads into it, it makes it more challenging. So for me, there is a very clear timeline when anxiety explosion started happening. And it's roughly around 2010, 2011. And that's because 2010, 2011, in my mind, is when the first smartphone came into play. And I look at the difference between both of my children. One is 28, one is 22, but those years, my oldest was into high school, like as a senior in high school, graduated in 2011, when all the social media stuff screamed into the world. And so from a developmental standpoint, he was pretty fairly well developed at 18 before he was influenced by all social media. In fact, to this day, he spends very little time in social media. It hasn't populated his life. And I remember as a senior in high school, he deactivated his Facebook page through the college process, because at the time, college admissions folks, and they still do that, were looking at all of these young adults looking to come into the college and looking at their social media presence. And so he deactivated his Facebook page, and all these other things weren't available as he moved through the college process, and then reactivated afterwards. But if you look at that for a minute, think about Snapchat and Instagram, Facebook Messenger, and now TikTok. Look at the amount of time and influence that has on the development of our children and their brains. And then for me, the piece that I just think about, like in the last 3 or 4 years, there have been close to 260 deaths, predominantly young men, based on taking selfies, high-risk selfie behavior resulting in their death. And for me, the whole piece of anxiety started with the selfie. When the world started thinking and turning inward, when our young people started recognizing the need to be inward facing, taking their selfies, showing it, as opposed to being available and around, looking at what the world had to offer, and the connections that created, and the carefreeness of not worrying about likes and posts and how many people respond to your post. When you look at some of the studies that were done, you can see the MRI imaging and the brain chemistry has shifted in the last decade plus. And in my mind, in my opinion, it really has a lot to do with the influence that social media has. I look at my daughter at 22, the amount of time that she's much more connected to her phone and Snapchat and Instagram and TikTok than my son is. And they're not that far apart in age, but the world shifted dramatically inside of that time with technology. And I'm not bashing technology 100%. I see the relevance and the need for it. I just honestly don't think it has done great things to adolescent development. In my mind, the explosion of anxiety-related disorders and anxiety really has a direct correlation to the age at which our young people jump into the social media platform, whereas their brain and their brain chemistry and their brain development hasn't been firmly established or connected before they're influenced by all these other external factors that weren't there 2 decades ago, a decade ago. And I also think it's pretty relevant that the heads of the Silicon Valley don't let their children have access to these devices because they're aware of the inherent dangers associated with it. That's pretty telling that their children aren't allowed to have Instagram or Snapchat or be on Facebook or have smartphones, because those individuals, my belief, my more cynical side would believe that they're probably privy to some documentation and some scientific data that they haven't shared with the world. So for me, I spent a lot of time talking to students in this realm in my coursework that I do with them in class and at times in interactions with them. And kids are always amazed at the fact that if you look at the amount of screen time I spend in a week, it's probably like 4 hours, 4.5 hours. And they're like, that's a day, right? I'm like, no, that's pretty much a week, or 10 days. And, COVID time and pandemic time, it's elevated a bit, but I don't spend a lot of time in social realms or on my phone. I'm much more interested in the interaction. And so I want to just look at this for a minute, behavioral manifestations of anxiety. You will see an increase of edginess or restlessness. Kids are more tired, or there's an increase of fatigue. They have a lower concentration. Raise your hand if your kids at times are more irritable. Increase of somatic complaints, or have difficulty sleeping. Those are all very clearly behavioral manifestations of anxiety. Now let's look at the behavioral manifestation of teenagers in general. They have an edginess or the restlessness, a sense of tiring or increased fatigue, at times lower concentration. Teenagers are irritable by definition. They have an increase of somatic complaints, and they have difficulty sleeping. So a traditional teenager in a traditional year, these are similar patterns of behavior to be expected. The nuance is to figure out, are you dealing with the traditional teenage angst and related adolescent development, or is there anxiety threading into it? And that, for me, is where I spend the meat of my time when students are in residence and populating the campus and I'm working through behavior, is to try to really spend time figuring out which is which. Is it just a recalcitrant teenager behaving like a teenager that will elicit a certain response from me? Is it a young person who truly is having an anxiety-based response to a situation that elicits a different response from you or the team of people that work here because you approach that differently? The challenge is to figure out which one you're dealing with at any particular moment of time. And you already know this, right? You can be engaging in a conversation with your child. Your child reacts and responds in a way that they come at you irritable, angry, agitated, frustrated. You sense and see that they're overwhelmed or they're struggling. So you modify your approach to be softer, kinder, more gently trying to come in. And then that would-be teenager is angry, agitated, and frustrated because you're belittling them or treating them like a baby. And that can happen within a 3-second conversation. And so you approach and try to respond. The would-be teenager pokes its angry head back up, calls you out for being condescending, belittling. I understand that very fine line that we all walk, but that for me is the most challenging place to be, is to try to flesh out and figure out, is it anxiety or is it just teenage angst? Because the response should and needs to be completely different. And so just remember, and then this is where I'm going to wrap up and Dan will take in, remember that anxiety responses are like snowflakes. Every single one is unique. They come in very different sizes. They can stay around for a while. Like today, sometimes they're light and fluffy. Sometimes they're heavier and harder to lift. And over time, they can add up to a lot more. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all with anxiety. There isn't a singular approach to respond to an anxiety-related response. There isn't a simple, easy solution to a child that's in a moment of crisis and anxiety is threaded through it. And it takes, in that moment, it takes you to think through and be rational and reasonable as the adult. And I can tell you, I wish I could do that really smoothly, easily with my child. And I promise you, I'm much better at doing it with your child. And so that's kind of where I'll stop and let Dan kind of swoop in and take over. So remember, I said like this was just the warm up. Here comes the good stuff. So thanks all for your attention, and I hope this helps.
Thanks, Rob, for setting me up like that. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up my material here. And what I'd like to start with, Rob, give me a thumbs up if my audio is okay here. You're the only one I can see. All right, thank you. So, Rob started on a personal level, so I guess I'll share a little personal anecdote. I was talking to a colleague this morning. I was complaining that I didn't sleep well last night. And she asked, well, were you feeling anxious about something? So I said, well, yeah, I got this presentation, it's kind of late tomorrow night and, I got to get prepared and everything. And she said, oh, what's the topic? Anxiety. And after a good laugh, she said, you should really share that because it's in keeping with the value of leaning into anxiety, I guess. naming it, talking about it, claiming it. I think anxiety is such a common experience, and there's so many different manifestations, as Rob mentioned. I just want to comment a few things, Rob, that I didn't jump in on. But when we're talking about the cell phone usage and the social media, it is sometimes referred to as social scrutiny. So if you think about it, if I have an awkward interaction at school and we don't have cell phones and social media, I've got at least 24 hours before I have to deal with that again. Now I could be sitting on the couch with my mom and dad watching a movie and having a negative social interaction right there and then on my screen. So I just think that it just opens up so many more opportunities for those anxiety producing interactions. I have also seen some data that suggests that there's a bit of an inverse curve with the social media and mental health, measures of mental health, where none at all sometimes is associated with some measures of mental health difficulty. Too much is clearly, and that's well documented. And somewhere in the middle, there's probably a sweet spot. So hopefully it's not all doom and gloom, because we're not all gonna go home and take the phones away from the kids and get them off of these platforms. It's just not realistic. So let me just start with the title here. And a year ago, when I started to think about this presentation right before COVID, I had thought about the titling it Anxious World, Anxious Kids. Rob has really covered that super well and spoken to that. So I'm just going to go with the generic anxiety. But within that, I just wanted to mention, as a starting point, I think language really matters. I thought about defeating anxiety. At EMS, they called it standing up to anxiety. I like that kind of language. I think when we can externalize anxiety and actually look at it, it's a good starting point. It's a healthy starting point. Just listen to these phrases and think about how they sit with you. So I can say, I'm anxious. I can say I have anxiety. I struggle with anxiety. Anxiety is a challenge. I'm managing anxiety. See, do you see the subtle shift in those terms? They all relate to the same general idea, and yet it's a little bit of a shift to the management side versus the victim side. And I think that's one of the themes in my short time that I'm hoping to kind of hit home with. And let's see, okay, slide 2. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on this. We just wanted to go into a little bit of how we work with it, how we can try to manage anxiety. Please bear with me with this. There's so many different directions we could go with this. PTSD is a major issue. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Rob touched on it. I also think that the origins of anxiety are really important. The genetic component. There's a lot of research too about disposition, and Rob, you mentioned this a little bit. Different individuals tend to have different pretty hardwired dispositions. Now, it is malleable to treatment and to working throughout life, but the tendency is there, and it's pretty biological. So in infants at the age of 12 months will actually respond differently and then throughout their life, you can tell based on those responses that they have an anxious disposition. So it's, there's that piece. The good thing is anxiety is the most treatable disorder that we have out there in the mental health world that we see clinically. So that's great. It's the most common, it's the most treatable. So I also can't fail to mention COVID and the fact that as adults, our own anxieties and fears obviously are elevated during this time. It hits all of the anxiety triggers. So the uncertainty, the danger, as we talked about, which triggers the fear, the unknowns, right? Anxiety thrives on the unknown. And also the social insecurity and isolation. I think that there's many layers of that social piece. When you step out your front door and you try to remember if you grabbed a mask or not, you try to make that decision. Is it okay to go in the grocery store at this time of day, or are there going to be too many people? Being judged. And of course, for many of our students and many of your children, the isolation of being remote. On the other hand, there's some promising reports of some kids who are actually thriving during this time. Now, they're going to need a lot of handholding to transition back to what will be kind of a return to some sort of new normal. But for the time being, it's not all bad. There are some families and there are some students who have found some bright spots within this, who have actually benefited from having a little bit less of that constant social experience in a sense that triggered a lot of their anxiety. So I think that it's worth really keeping that in mind. It's a bit of a mixed picture for some of the kids. We don't need to do too much on this either. This is sort of my working definition of anxiety. So it's just an overestimation of the danger, meaning both the potency, how powerful this danger is and how likely it is to happen. So how bad is it? How likely is it? And then combined with an underestimation of my ability to cope or my likelihood of getting help. And that's where we see, I know students who come to Landmark often, it takes a while for them to build trust that they will actually get the help that's being promised, because in the past they have not gotten that help. And we definitely see that. Thankfully, a lot of times over the years, we see the students really thrive with that kind of support. We're not doing it for them, but the help is there. Fear versus anxiety, Rob, you spoke to this. The one thing I would add would be fear is encountering a bear in the woods. Anxiety is worrying about encountering a bear in the woods. Kind of a nice breakdown. And depending on how close you are to the woods and whether there's bears around, some anxiety is a little bit more valid, some is a little bit more far-fetched. There's a whole continuum. Average versus clinically significant. Everybody has anxiety. We'll get to that next slide. It's biological. So let's just start from there. But is it just merely uncomfortable or is it debilitating? That's really where, again, there is a continuum, but there's clear situations where we have students who really need the support of clinical treatment for their anxiety. And we don't want to miss that. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So the anxiety process, this is an interaction between our biology, basically, our neural networks, and our cognitive process, which is really the narrative, the running narrative of our thoughts that kind of feed us information about what our experience is in the world as we navigate it, right? So we have neurons firing, and then we have kind of our lived experience of what that thought process, what those thoughts and emotions feel like. So we've all heard about the fight or flight instinct or response. There's usually a freeze component to that as well, but we commonly call it fight or flight. This is just the autonomic nervous system response. So basically, it's the fire alarm system of your brain. And when we go through the world looking for threats, we're negative. We look more for negative than positive because it's more likely to be dangerous to us. So our amygdala, which is kind of in our midbrain limbic area, is basically our fire alarm. If you're riding a bike and suddenly you hit gravel and begin to skid, what happens? You immediately put your feet out on the ground, stabilize you. You don't think about it. It's automatic. Afterwards, your heart's pounding, but you're riding a bike, so it's okay. Imagine if your anxiety onset is sitting in a classroom. Suddenly something triggers that anxiety response, a surge of adrenaline, your heart starts pounding. Maybe it's even just what your thoughts are doing to you. Maybe it's something that pops up on Snapchat right there. Your amygdala is saying, get out of here, you're in danger. And yet in our modern society, the things that trigger our anxiety are not those types of things that we can run away from, not those types of things that we can fight off. So it's just a fundamental, difficult challenge to begin to translate what currently triggers anxiety to sort of how our biology was wired to handle fear. So I throw this in here because I really like kind of simple things that I'm going to remember. You could get some really nice complicated models of brain anatomy, but this is just like a simple little way to kind of keep in mind what it's like. So if this is your brain, your amygdala in your limbic or mid kind of more primitive part of your brain is usually just sitting there waiting, not really running the show. And your cortex areas, your prefrontal cortex, that's really where you're making decisions, you're paying attention, you're using your logical brain, you're planning, all of those things that we associate with sort of being a effective person out there in the world. When we encounter something that triggers that fight or flight response, it's like all that goes out the window. All right, you kind of blow your top, and there's no real connection between when the limbic system, those emotions take over the emotional brain. It's very hard to rationalize with ourselves or others in that moment. I'm sure we've all had that experience, both for ourselves and for our kids, when they really just blow their top and are not rational because their emotional centers have really triggered this massive response. Forgive me, many of you I know are well aware of this. I just, it's always good to review and just kind of make sure that we keep in mind the various elements, the biological elements, and then the cognitive elements, and then the family elements too. We'll talk about that. So how we see this play out. We all know, we recognize anxiety when we see it for the most part. It manifests in so many different ways. This is just some of the more common ones. Avoidance is the number one. It's the number one way to cope with something that is essentially fearful. Of course, it makes sense. Shutting down is another one we see, which is just a way to sort of emotionally and cognitively avoid an interaction or a situation. We'll see a student with the hood up over their head and head down on the desk. Maybe they stayed up too late, or maybe it's something more, and maybe that's just their way to kind of remove themselves emotionally from what's an overwhelming situation. It can be masked and hidden. We have plenty of students on campus that walk around looking like they have it all together and yet struggle with debilitating anxiety. And I think one of the things that we try to do, I know Rob, certainly your department and ours and really every staff that interacts with kids, is to really develop the trust so that kids don't feel like they have to wear a mask and they can reach out for help when they need to. But sometimes it takes a long time. And it's often helpful when parents reach out and share a little bit of what they see as well. Acting out in oppositional behavior, much of what we see as oppositional behavior is just a kid who doesn't have the coping strategies to deal with some level of stress or anxiety. It's not always true, because sometimes if they're able to get something that they want through that behavior, we haven't set up the rules appropriately, right? But once we get the rules set up appropriately, the expectations of the environment, if we still see a lot of that oppositional behavior, it's making life harder for that student. So why would they be doing that if they could choose a better option? So often it's just another way to mask anxiety. Some people see anxiety as a weakness. It's hard to admit. It's easier to exhibit kind of a oppositional bravado than to say, like, actually, I'm just really anxious and I don't know how else to act. And then finally, hypervigilance is simply just scanning your environment for threats at all times. It's exhausting, but this is what anxiety feels like on a day-to-day basis. Rob, you mentioned the LBLD and higher levels of anxiety. So I don't think I have a whole lot new in that realm here. Again, though, with the executive functioning challenges, sometimes they're associated with LBLD. It's hard when you don't feel like you can understand and control your environment. If things are moving a little too quickly, if it's hard for you to sustain attention and really understand what's going on in a classroom, you feel like you really can't control your situation. So it's an external locus of control. And that's an anxiety trigger right there. If I feel like what happens to me is more what I choose and the actions that I take, then I'm empowered. If I feel like what happens to me is beyond my control and just external forces working my life, that's going to make me anxious, and for good reason. The last one is social appraisal and evaluation. This is what we see more and more and more. And we try to support kids through that to understand, when you're putting stuff out there, and then you're checking every 5 minutes to, even more than that, to see what kind of likes you're getting. it's exhausting. And so it's an uphill battle, but I don't think that it's new. It's just accentuated by the technology that we have today. All right, so how we tend to respond. Don't read too much into this, but as you can see, my little cartoon here, it's not very reassuring, is it? Reassurance is often a technique that we try to use, and it has its place, but in the presence of real ongoing anxiety, it tends to be ineffective, because as you can see, the point of the cartoon is as soon as I say, don't worry, this bad thing won't happen, where does your mind immediately go? Well, what if it does? That bad thing could happen, right? So if Danielle had told me, don't worry, no one's going to Zoom bomb your presentation and put horrid pictures up right in front of everyone. If she'd said that to me, I'd be anxious this whole time that was going to happen. I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't know if it does happen. So far, so good. I skipped the debate the situation. Basically, that would just be saying like, oh, that's not true. You're overthinking it. Just trying to contradict the anxiety rather than naming the anxiety. Okay. I think the best thing we can do for our kids is to help them develop their emotional intelligence, right? And how do we do that is we help them to understand and name what they're feeling. And we validate that that's understandable, even if we're still going to push them through that discomfort. It's really important for us to kind of become more comfortable talking about the emotions and naming it. So we let kids get out of it sometimes. There's a place for that every once in a while, but generally just reinforces that we shouldn't, that they won't have to do it next time. Okay, say don't worry, right? And then as the kids are still anxious, we say it louder and more often. Don't find that to be too effective, and we'll talk about why in a second. Threatening sometimes, when we get to our wit's end, we just say, fine, you're gonna fail then, or something along those lines. That's when we start to lose our own emotions, start to predominate, and we're elevating our own level of affect. So watch our tone, watch our volume, watch our language. Here, if you can see this, I know it's a little text heavy, but I tried to shift to some more effective responses. Let me speak to that issue of don't worry for a minute. So what you will hear is people will tell you don't use that intervention. And the logic of it is, well, first of all, we shouldn't tell people how to feel, even if we don't think they should feel that way. To them, their emotions are valid. As you can see, anxiety feels necessary to the anxious person. So we have to respect that, right? That being said, I do not want you to think that it's never okay to say, don't worry. I really don't think we need to be so rigid. It's the big picture attitude that's more important here. In other words, if we say the wrong thing to our kids, we're not going to break them. We say the right thing, and half the time we're not going to get the response we want anyway. So don't worry is fine when it's said in the spirit of compassion and support. But if it's used as a solution, it's just not probably going to get us very far. And then probably the most important thing that we can do is, to the best of our ability, model. So identify our emotions when we're experiencing them. Try to calm ourselves down before we engage with our kids. Re-regulate ourselves, and then we can also work to help them re-regulate. And we probably some that will get into the more discussion and answer time. There's just a little too much to cover all at once. I have a few more slides, and then I think we'll probably shift to maybe talk about or see what questions are out there. Anxiety management in clinical settings, cognitive behavioral therapy is very effective. There's a little graphic here about the interaction between kind of our thoughts or what we tell ourselves, the behaviors that we engage in, the emotions, and how everything affects everything else. And the piece that we used to miss is the bodily sensations, the physical aspect of our emotional experience. It used to be a triangle, but it's much more than that. That's why mindfulness and relaxation practices, things that help down regulate fight or flight response, things that calm ourselves. Those are really critical in anxiety management. And I think that in the clinical world, we missed that for a long time. So I'm glad that mindfulness and relaxation practices are really getting that emphasis that they should. Exposure response prevention is exposure therapy, basically. One of the things that I think we can use in any setting that comes out of that is scaling questions. So they emphasize scaling on a scale of 1 to 10, or in some cases 1 to 100. How much anxiety do you anticipate feeling in that situation? And then what we do is we really find the sweet spot between something that is uncomfortable but probably doable with some support. And then gradually we work on those, become more comfortable with them, and move on to the next thing. I'm not going to really go into any more depth on that, but I'd be happy to talk further about that if there's interest. Psychopharmacology, let me just mention that. So anxiety responds often really well to the antidepressant class of medications called SSRIs. I almost wish that it wasn't known as the antidepressant medications, because it's equally effective with anxiety in many cases. And so when the intensity and the duration of the anxiety is such that we need additional interventions and just the therapeutic support isn't enough, it's very reasonable to look at that as a second line intervention. Obviously, we start with some of the other things first. These are just like the last kind of few things that were rattling around in my mind as I was putting this together. Be careful about talking about safe language, and here's why. If we say, oh, don't worry, you'll be safe, or do you feel safe, in a setting where true safety is not at issue, it can begin to send the message that environments are generally not safe, or the default is not safe. So we want to be careful of that. That being said, when there's trauma, it's a little bit more complicated, and there's too much to really get into with that, but just be aware that some feelings of discomfort are going to be part of the process of overcoming or learning to manage anxiety. And then global language, I'll always be a failure, I'll never succeed, no one will like me. Those are the types of things that we can debate all you want, but usually if you hear that, that's a cue that there's a strong emotion there. Go to the emotion, don't necessarily try to debate the issue. Or if there's specifics that you can help a student process within that to get out of that kind of global catastrophic thinking, that's really what we want to do in that situation. Let's see. Okay, so we are getting down to the wire here. Our homes are echo chambers for emotion, guys. So I've said that a bunch of times, but that's really something that we all need to be aware of. I have 2 kids of my own. I know this stuff, but I don't always do it. And I catch myself, and if I could give everybody one piece of advice, one of the most powerful things you can do is apologize. If you really want an opportunity to have a true interaction with your child, if you messed up, even if you really didn't mess up that much, but you can find an opportunity to say, hey, I was thinking about that. I don't think I said that right thing there, or I think I came across wrong, or I think it was wrong. It opens up the door to partnering with them. And that's kind of where we want to go with this. Here towards the bottom, you'll see that entry, parents versus teen plus worry. In other words, is it a parent versus the teen and the worry, and the teen and the worry are the ally? Or is it the parent and the teen allying to manage the worry? That's the goal. Rewarding progress, giving praise where you see it, that allies you with your child against the worry, where you can both work together to help manage it. All right, a couple just different images to share. This is, I don't know, I just like this because it came across my social media feed actually. And what I would suggest is if you struggle with anxiety, this looks like normal. If you don't struggle with anxiety, it looks awful. But I like that there's a certain amount of hopefulness, and this individual is not defeated by all these challenges, although obviously it's not an easy life on a day-to-day basis to suffer from that kind of anxiety. I'm going to skip ahead, Danielle, and maybe we can start to move into questions. Folks, you're going to see a couple slides that these will be shared. And what they are is these are just worksheets that I created with students to help them manage their anxiety. They're very wordy. Please don't feel like you have to read them demo right now. I thought I would put them in there just as examples. And as you see on the right here in the box, we used a 1 to 10 scale. Really helpful to start to measure progress. Expect to worry, be unsure and uncomfortable on purpose. Bridge back to your successes, breathe, know what you want, and take on those worries. So that's the end of my presentation, the portion of mine, and Danielle, we'll maybe turn it back to you.
Thanks, Dan. That was great. One thing that you mentioned that I would just like to highlight is sort of that partnership, and the partnership between parent and student, parent in the school, different allies the student may have at the school, and what that can look like. And I would just underscore for this group to please utilize your resources at Landmark to continue to partner, because this is an evolving topic, and your students are evolving. So we want to make sure that we're supporting that. At this point, I don't see any questions. Folks, you're welcome to put those in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute and ask a question directly to either of our speakers, I'll give you a chance to do that.
I'm going to ask a question. So my son Sean is a junior, and just after this break now, they started to shift into college, thinking about what he's going to do for college. So when he first started at Landmark, he has a ton of anxiety, and now living at home virtually, it's been a little bit of a struggle. Just managing, he's doing really well, but in terms of managing everything and having that outlet, because he's with us all the time versus being with all of you, on the campus, has been a little struggle. So we have twins, so there's the double struggle. So his sister is doing the same thing. She's very good at basketball, so she's being recruited. So it's a completely different venue, if you will, in this house. So he mentioned recently that he's not interested in going to college. So I said, okay, it just came out in conversation. I said, that's fine. You have to do what you have to do. We'll figure it out. But of course, right now we're in the next year and a half of all we do is talk about college. My husband almost had a coronary when he said it, because of course he has to go to college. So his dad thinks. So what do I do to, I told him, college isn't for everybody. It's not going to be a pressure thing, a pressure cooker. There are different places that you can go to, colleges that will help you, and, executive functioning and just being organized and having you manage. But he's done a great job, in the last 3 years, just being an advocate for himself, even internally, like in our family where he feels most comfortable, he'll say things like, Mom, I can't do that. So don't tell me to do it if I can't. So I don't know how to help him with the anxiety of college, and it's around him everywhere. How do we do that?
Dan, I think you're muted. I'm going to unmute you.
Thank you. So the first thing I would say is we see that junior year, they start to have these workshops. It is overwhelming feeling, and so again, your first instinct when you feel threatened by something that seems outside of your control and totally unmanageable is just like, nope, I'm not doing it. And Rob, I know you have many more years of experience watching this pattern play out, but I have seen that pattern where junior year, many students just avoid it entirely, and then they're confronted with it when they have to really deal with it their senior year. But it's challenging to wrap your head around it all. And when senior year starts, there's a much more of a methodical kind of support in place, I would say, perhaps. I just have had many kids in my office being like, I can't do this. And then come December, they're like, yeah, my applications are in, and I'm, feeling relieved. So I guess I'm a bit hopeful.
Leah, I'm going to jump in. Leah, I'm surprised that you're surprised by this response from him. Every single thing that he has ever faced that was new, different, made her uncomfortable, he instantly refused to be part of.
This is true, but I think part of the issue, a bigger issue, is that he's at home with us and not with you guys on campus. And I think that actually exacerbates it.
Yeah, you parents are really hard to raise. And if
We
you
are, we
all
really,
the time, it's brutal. I say that to the kids that are here. So my take with him is my recommendation, do the perfect thing. It's not that, and you do that all the time. It's not that big a deal. Yep, not everyone has to go to college, and just let him just walk the system. And it's not surprising to me that his response was, no, I'm not going. He's in competition and comparison in his own mind with his sister. It's been that way since I've known him, which now is, 3 years. And I'm not surprised by any of that. And I'm not going to be surprised to tell you, oh, look, he's going to college and he got into the right school and he's fine. He is that proverbial kid that needs to process at his own time, his own pace, under his own understanding, but he needs to create the barrier of defensiveness. So if it doesn't work out that way, he feels self-protected. He has done that with every single thing we have ever pushed him and challenged him to do. This should not surprise you at all.
so I agree with you to a certain degree. 100% right. That's how he operates. However, I just feel I'm at a loss because we don't have, he's not in your, it was so much easier when he was living there. As much as I didn't want him to live there, it was just, I think he felt stronger and more courageous, if you will, underneath your roof versus our roof. So I pray, believe me, I pray his senior year is back living there, because I do worry about, he's not in classes hopefully every Wednesday when the weather's better, but he's not amongst you guys. And I think it's very difficult just being in our house. As much as I love him, I do think it's very hard. And I don't know how to handle being a parent, like that kind of anxiety. Like Rob, you've seen thousands of kids go through this.
This would be a piece where I just say, let the guidance process unfold with him, and they will walk him every step of the way through it and give him the necessary time to adjust to each step. And he wouldn't be the first student that would say to the guidance, I don't want to go to college. They are masterful at just maneuvering them through that and supporting them into that. That's fine. You don't need to go to college. But hey, if you were, what would you be interested? They will take care of that for him. And I dare to say, I promise, but I'm pretty close to believing that this time next year, he'll be looking at the college acceptances. And then the next round of angst is, which one do I actually select to go to?
Amen to that. Thank you.
That's a great question, Leah. Thank you. Thanks for getting us started. I'm going to read the questions that we have in the chat, and then we'll continue if there's time. So Kate asked, Dan, could you repeat a list of the ways folks can talk about anxiety? So less of the victim.
Yeah, thank you for that question. This first occurred to me in working with kids with bipolar disorder who would talk about, I have bipolar, I just was diagnosed, now I have bipolar. And it really turned into conversations, and this was in a group setting, is why do we label ourselves as if we are our diagnosis, right? And so, using language that's not, that doesn't diminish the significance of it, and I certainly want to be careful not to do that, not to invalidate people's experience, but talking about it in ways that it's something that I experience, but it doesn't define me, right? So we could come up with language, saying I am anxious. That could just be a state, but it also almost sounds like a trait, like anxiety is me. And you can talk to people who struggle with this. It would say, well, yeah, that's kind of how it feels. But as we start to externalize it using language, it's kind of like anxiety is something that I frequently have to deal with. Anxiety is part of my life, but it's not all of my life. Then you realize that you kind of have a relationship that's not fixed with the anxiety. And there's a couple schools of thought. Some people would say, kick it to the curb, use all this like rah, let's get rid of the anxiety. I'm sure there's a place for that. I find a little bit more of kind of a treating yourself and your anxiety experience, a little more kindness, a little bit more understanding, and kind of learning to work with it that tends to work better for me in my work and personally. Does that answer your question?
And I want to jump into.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that was helpful. You had listed a few things earlier, and exactly that. I am anxious. You turn that around just using grammar to say, as you said, anxiety is me. Wait a minute. that doesn't bode well for what you're really trying to say. Or I think you said another one was I deal with anxiety, or something like that. And then you can turn that one around. Actually, it says, well, anxiety deals with me. Well, no, no, no. I don't want to give anxiety that power, right?
Right.
So I think I might be able to come up with a couple more of those that are helpful to think about it and how to express it. That was just really helpful for me. Thank you.
I think the power of language is really huge. And when I listen to kids' stories and they tell me, oh, this happened to me in third grade, this happened to me in fifth grade, I'm very quick to stop them for a minute, because when we use that phrase, this happened to me, it creates this awareness that I was participating in this. When you're riding your bike too fast and you fall, you happen to skin your knee. I say to kids all the time, no, in third grade, when the teacher said something mean, that just didn't happen to you. That was done to you. That didn't happen to you. That was done to you. And that gives that separation of, yeah, you know what, you're right. That was done to me. It didn't happen to me, because happen implies that I participated in it. And it's very subtle language when you work with them, when you listen to their story and give them an opportunity to create a different narrative for those early educational experiences that doesn't put the blame on them. I guarantee you the majority of your children feel that it's their fault. The majority of children in some level, no matter how it was shaped that Landmark School is this great opportunity, I can promise you that somewhere in the back of your head, it's I'm going to Landmark School because I couldn't go to school at home, because I have a learning disability, because something's wrong with me. That populates in their head, and to help them shift that narrative to be more positive about who they are, and to take away the responsibility of their educational concerns, failures that they had in their younger grades, and shift it where it belongs to the inept educators who didn't know how to address their needs. So I'm very clear to challenge them when they say, this happened. No, it was done to you in third grade. It didn't happen to you in third grade. And give them that permission to separate from that and not own it. So the language that we use with them, and more importantly, the language that they use, is really, really important to listen and challenge where appropriate, to give them permission to not own some of the baggage that they all carry.
Well said, Rob. Another question, do we have any mindfulness training classes for teens? Is that something that is available now or will be in the future?
I'm going to jump into this from a historical perspective. We have tried, your children, to get them to sit still for anything, let alone sit still and go into a mindfulness realm. It's like herding cats. And it often happens at a place in time where there's a lot of other things to do. What we've been very successful doing, however, is threading concepts of mindfulness through the yoga program that happens during the day. So we have yoga during the day as an elective they can take. And then when we're functioning as a traditional school with after-school activities, yoga is offered after school as well. And then residentially, we thread in some of the evening work and offer some of those kind of opportunities for them. But the whole school would need to wrap its brain around the fact that we're all going to do mindfulness at the same time in order for that to be effective. And like I said, we had a staff person years ago that went off, and we supported them to do all this training, and they tried to infuse it in, and we tried to offer it in various places. And the kids were like, what? No, that's not, I can't sit still in class. You expect me to sit still and think and think about what I'm thinking about? I do that all the time anyway. So we've tried it. I'm very pro mindfulness. I see I see the effectiveness of it. We've had to sneak it in other places, and yoga has been the place that we've snuck it in the most successful. Now, I know the counseling department does a lot of that on a one-to-one work with kids, but from a larger school standpoint, yoga has been the most successful way we've kind of pushed in the mindfulness opportunities.
It's like sneaking the spinach in the smoothie. One more question. Does Landmark have any social emotional curriculum to help kids understand and normalize their emotional challenges, such as anxiety and depression?
Rob, I'd be curious what, where you see that, but I know we've done the work, again, some of the all school workshops that Andrea was doing last year were really aimed at mental health and wellness. And then some of the classes in the EL department certainly cover that. I'm constantly impressed with just the quality of the social emotional content that they get. through those classes. But
Yeah, I would say like the social communications curriculum that's threaded through the expressive language program does a lot of that work, and it works with students inside that program to then spread that knowledge about what they need into the other classes and to other places that they're going to be. And I think the whole concept of social emotional language, I know there are a bunch of us that just finished a 10-week course that was offered by Yale and the Center for Social and Emotional Learning, directed by Dr. Mark Brackett. So there's a group of us that just did this. And so we're beginning to figure out how we can thread some of that language into our program and how and where it's going to be. I know from a residential standpoint, I'm looking to spend some time with the residential staff, making sure that we're populating some of those concepts into the work we do with students in the evening hours. So it is there. It's just kind of moving in a measured pace.
Great. Does anyone else have any other questions they'd like to ask at this time? All right, well, I'll just repeat that you have wonderful resources at Landmark School. I know Rob and Dan would be happy to continue these conversations with you, as would your students advisor and other folks on campus that they have a relationship with. So I so appreciate everyone tuning in tonight. This was a great turnout, and it's so good to have the conversation and hear what other people are doing and how they're managing anxiety with their students and what that looks like at Landmark. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to our speakers for being here, and stay safe and warm. Hopefully we'll see you soon.